Professor Manik, if you can start, please. Thank you. Please unmute yourself.
Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today titled The Recent KZN Floods, an autopsy of a natural disaster, or rather natural hazard, which became a disaster. I am Professor Sadna Manik from Geography Education, located within the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I would like to briefly hand over the reins to Prof. Thabo Msibi, who is the Dean of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He will undertake the official welcome on behalf of the university. Prof.
Thank you very much, Professor Manik, members of the University Council and executives present, fellow deans, the Minister Pravin Gordhan, South African Minister of Public Enterprise, members of other government departments that are present today, members of various municipalities that are present today, colleagues from other higher education institutions, locally, nationally, and internationally, colleagues from the corporate sector and NGOs, members of the media, alumni, both local and international, staff and students, all protocol observed. A very good afternoon to all of you, and a warm welcome to this important seminar focused on the recent catastrophic floods that occurred in our province. The University of KwaZulu-Natal is very pleased to be hosting the first of many conversations that will focus on climate change and the broader social justice project in particular, with a concentration on these recent floods. We believe that the devastating floods that happened this month demand swift action if we're to safeguard this planet for future generations. The reverberating message from most scientists, government officials, and other observers is that these floods were the worst in the history of this province and indeed South Africa. More than 400 people lost their lives, 54 remain missing. More than 40,000 people have been left homeless. There has been a major devastation to our infrastructure, with many of our roads that are still inaccessible due to the damage. Many people remain without water and electricity. The floods have affected people across racial, class, gender, and other backgrounds, with the poor being the most impacted as they remain vulnerable. There have been many questions as to the reasons for this devastation. Some have sought answers from religious scripts, others have looked at the historical weather patterns, whilst others, like me, have looked to science for some answers. We know that for many years, scientists have been warning us about the effects of global warming on the planet. We've been warned repeatedly that the increase in greenhouse gas emissions will increasingly result in significant changes to the planet. These changes, as the US Environmental Protection Agency notes, include an increase in the average temperature of Earth, a reduction of ice and snow cover, a rise in the acidity levels of the oceans, a shift in the characteristics of the ecosystem, and of course, an increase in the frequency, intensity, and or duration of extreme weather events, as witnessed recently in the KZN floods. What remains clear is that KwaZulu-Natal, and indeed the whole country, is unprepared for extreme changes that we're witnessing recently. Our time planning and disaster management efforts require urgent attention. They need to provide adequate, dignified housing for our people and to address the legacy of apartheid insofar as land disposition is concerned have become more urgent. We have organized this webinar with a view of initiating these critical conversations so that we're better prepared for the future and also to support the rebuilding efforts in KZN. There have been questions asked about the timing of this event. Is it really appropriate to host such an event when people are still suffering from the devastations of the floods? It's a difficult question that has been posed. However, our view is that there can never be a better time than right now when everything is still fresh. The need and urgency for action compel us to not only build physically, but to also build awareness and knowledge. These floods are the worst we've ever seen or experienced in recent memory. The certainty of similar, if not worse, events in future is guaranteed. Renowned climatologist Professor Francois Engelbrecht notes that the frequency of extreme weather conditions will increase, and as has been witnessed in the last decade. While some have sought to deny these recent events as being the result of climate change, one cannot deny that we are seeing an increasing frequency and severity of floods in this province. In Pinetown alone, where the School of Education is located, more than 398 millimeters of rain poured within 15 hours, a space of 15 hours in the recent floods. In the last couple of years, we've witnessed a significant number of flooding events in Durban, which have resulted in a loss of life and damage to property. These events call upon us to act and to act now. It would, in fact, be irresponsible as a knowledge-generating institution to remain quiet when society is relying upon us to lead the way. It is important, though, to highlight that UKZN is not only just contributing intellectually to the debates around the recent flooding, but we also have responded as an institution to provide support to the affected students, staff, and communities. The Vice-Chancellor has established a team that is led by the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research, Professor Musa Moshabela, to provide expert support to the province. He's also made contributions, financial contributions at least, to the Mart Institute to provide counseling and support in the affected communities. We also are providing food parcels, water, clothes, and other supplies to make sure that communities and our staff and students are supported. The School of Education is in particular addressed or responded by forming partnership with schools where we are seeking donations to support affected communities. We'll also be offering tutorial support for the learners that have missed classes due to the flooding events. We also hope long-term to include matters of climate change and social justice within the curriculum through our social cohesion task team. Of course, we are also engaging through the seminars in a knowledge building exercise that we hope will inform the future direction of the country, and of course, that we hope will result in real change for our people. We want to welcome you to this event and want to thank you for attending. We thank our expert panel for their availability at such short notice, and our facilitator, Professor Manik, who has organized and will be leading this event today. We hope that it's going to be a worthwhile and informative session for all of you. A very, very warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Msebi. Let me begin by now unpacking the title for today's webinar and next week, Tuesday's webinar as well, because there is a follow-up webinar on the 3rd of May, also at 2 o'clock. So the concept of an autopsy is used in conjunction with the floods and the landslides as hazards to signify, first and foremost, the loss of lives. Furthermore, I emphasize that this was a hazard which became a disaster because of particular factors which we are today aiming to drill into and carve up. There's a lot to dissect, and it's not going to be pleasant because we will focus on the array of risks and vulnerabilities, exposure to the hazards. We will incorporate aspects of climate change and then delve into the nature of hazards itself. Grassroots level, we will look at experiences, and then we turn to local government spatial planning and, of course, internal research that's being undertaken. What we do know is that Prof. Colleen Vogel, as far back as 2019, stated that rainfall has been regarded as the most significant climate parameter affecting human lives. This we can acknowledge. So this two-part webinar then is a tribute to the victims of the KZN floods, those who are suffering losses, those who have lost their lives or lost loved ones. We acknowledge that there are residents right now still suffering in the aftermath of the floods. There's water and energy insecurity, apart from food insecurity and inadequate spaces to house the affected victims. We know that there's also health-related risks from waterborne diseases. We also acknowledge the economic impacts of the hazards, but we want to foreground the environment here. In terms of structure, this webinar is sequenced to first understand the nuances of the floods. We look at the social and spatial context of the flood and landslides, causes, experiences, current planning. So it's about trying to understand and piece together what happened and why. And then in part 2, we will delve into how we need to prepare to identify risks and vulnerabilities in advance so that we don't ever experience a similar disaster. Let me now turn to our first speaker, Dr. Charles McRobert. He's a geotechnical engineer at Stellenbosch University. He holds degrees from UCT and WITS. His research interests include exploring the science of slope stability and the art of decision-making. His expertise lies in seepage, shear strength, slope stability, and geotechnical knowledge systems. Dr. McRobert has been repeatedly quoted in respect of his paper titled How Geology Put a South African City at Risk. But what I want to do is I want to also play a little bit of devil's advocate here and ask Dr. McRobert in his presentation to also hone in on other influences in terms of geomorphic terrain, in terms of meteorology, because these also resonate with me as a geographer. What is the role of flood events that we've already experienced that have been impacted upon by cut-off low pressure systems? So I will turn now to Dr. McRobert. I'm sure that he's got his presentation ready for us. Dr. McRobert.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone. It's really great to be a part of this. There's a number of esteemed guests amongst us, and I am really privileged to speak to you all today. But I know that time is limited, so I'm going to bring up my slides so long. And really, the focus of my presentation is going to be to look at the geology of eThekwini and how that has factored into the catastrophes that we have seen. Now, the flooding and the landslides are separate events, and this talk really is focusing on the factors that led to this landslides that we've witnessed in the region. Now, if we look at a geological section, and this is a geological section from the Drakensberg right the way down through to the Durban area, and I'm going to just go to my next slide, which focuses in on the area from Pietermaritzburg to Durban. And as we move in from the sea, the first formation that we have that is of importance is what's called the barrier formation or the barrier sands. And these are a ridge of sands that are right adjacent to the sea. And then the next group of importance is what we call the Eka shales. And these are come next. And then we have the Natal group sandstones. Now, the Natal group sandstones probably underlay most of the region where landslides took place. But one of the characteristic things that you will notice about these formations is that they all dip towards the sea. And so what that means is that the soil that lies above these formations that are dipping are prone to sliding. So where they are exposed, they will slide. And so that is one of the main geological factors that makes this area particularly at risk. And we see towards Pietermaritzburg, they dip a lot flatter. And so the soils that overlay these formations aren't as at risk. And I'm just going to go through the three formations in quick succession. The barrier sands formation. Now, this is research that was done in 1957 along the Bluff area, which is to the south of the Durban Harbour. There were a lot of slips or landslides, and so they were investigated at that time. And these barrier sands, as we call them, are predominantly made up of sand. So this is just a technical graph that illustrates the particle size that make up these sands. And there is a bit of variation along the formation, as you'd expect in geology, but predominantly they're made up of sands. And at this time, one of the contributing factors that they found that caused these landslides was when there was a lot of concentrated flow through these barrier sands. And as you can see from these figures that are taken from a subsequent publication in 1984, there was a recommendation that there should be no foundations or stormwater drains within the top 6 meters of very steeply inclined areas. And that is because this material cannot resist the flow of water and just simply erodes. Now, I think a photo that illustrates this quite clearly. This is from a failure in 2019, taken from a student of mine's work, and he went and looked at various failures before the catastrophic ones that we've just witnessed now. And I think this photo is very characteristic of the type of failures that occur in these barrier formations. At the top here, we see a broken stormwater pipe, and we just see all the sand that is eroded away. So most of the failures in this barrier formation will be as a consequence of poorly controlled surface water flow. And this is a more dramatic picture of a similar type of failure. And we can see that it also, in this case, brought down a portion of a housing complex. And so that is really the risk of these sands of the barrier formation. As we move inland, we come to what are called the Eka shales. And these are basically rocks that are made up of very fine particles, silt and clay. And the clay layers are very prone to sliding. Now, this is from a study that was done in the 1970s, and Elf Place, which is over there on the map, is right over there. Hopefully you can see my mouse. But this was, as these were investigations as part of the construction of the ring roads around Durban. And basically when they were building this, there had been a previous failure along this surface. And we can see how it's dipping down towards the bottom of this valley. And there was a sliding plane that developed and that was found to be in the clay. And one of the key things to note about these failures in the Eka shales, they're often not due to intense rainfall. Being silt and clay, the water flows very slowly in them. And so they come about by long-term seepage, such as from leaking pipes or soakaways. And one area in Durban that is on these is what's called the Clare Estate. And these are just some pictures that show the effects of it, and also the fact that people are often forced to live in areas that are prone to failure. So this was a satellite image from the 12th of June 2019. Unfortunately, there's no satellite imagery from the recent flood to use. But a month later, a landslide formed in this. And as you will know from the climate, this is in the drier season. So this is not even caused by rainfall. This is just caused by abundance of water seeping into the ground. And within a month later, structures had already been erected in that area. And this will probably feature in next week's webinars. How do we actually deal with mitigating these risks? The next group is the Natal group sandstones, which overlie most of the area. And in particular here, we are interested in these colluviums. So colluviums are naturally weathered material that are basically just moving down slopes over time. And I think it's interesting to note, so the last time there were a lot of landslides in the area was in September 1987. And the records of rainfall preceding and during the event are indicated in this graph. And as you'll notice, this is September. So this is also in the drier part of the season there. But there was 74 millimeters preceding and then 590 millimeters over 4 days. So this actually is probably more rain than occurred in the current events. But in this case, in the flooding that's occurred or the landslides that have occurred now, we are actually at the end of our wet season. So we've had a lot more rain preceding this event. And we were actually, in fact, very close to these levels of rainfall. And in this case, in 1987, the effect of this on the colluviums is illustrated in these photos. And we see, as was mentioned earlier, that the devastation was felt both by the poor and by the rich. And these photos from 1987 could quite easily be used today to illustrate, or could be photos that were taken during the recent flooding in the last 2 weeks. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation. Hopefully it has helped you to see a little bit what lies beneath the ground around eThekwini and how this has contributed to the landslides that we have witnessed over the last 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. We do have some time for at least 1 or 2 questions. Is there anyone who has a burning question for Charles? You are welcome to raise your hand or to put a question in the chat box so that we can read it out. Okay, so first question that I have, Charles, is that would you say there are areas that should not be built on? This is from Stephanie Chitter.
Yes, so there are regions that shouldn't be built on, and the eThekwini municipality have a department that actually looks at these geological aspects. And they have published maps of areas which shouldn't be built in due to geological or geotechnical considerations. And they do review new proposals for developments. But there are often a lot of conflicting issues that need to be resolved. It's not just simply an issue of saying, no, you can't build, or yes, you can build. Because there are various political pressures, sociological pressures that have to be also dealt with. So it's not an easy question to answer, but yes, there are areas that shouldn't be built on, but whether they can actually be prevented from building in those regions is another question.
Thank you, Charles. We'll take one more question. This is from Yolanda. And her question reads, can we control the water flow to prevent landslides in this geography? How costly would this be? I'm not sure if you're able to answer that, but...
Yeah, so I think in the barrier formations, definitely stormwater design, we can design stormwater systems to control the stormwater so that it doesn't flow uncontrolled over the barrier formations. In the Eka shales, a lot of it is got to do with getting rid of a lot of seepage water. So again, if it can be piped, it can be removed from there. In the Natal groups, a lot of it is just rainfall, and there it becomes very difficult to control that water flow. As to the exact cost, it'll probably cost a lot of money.
Okay, thanks very much, Charles. Unfortunately, we only have time to take 2 questions. We'll leave the rest of the questions till the end of the session.
Perfect.
Our next speaker today is Bobby Peake. Bobby Peake is the Director of Groundwork, Friends of the Earth South Africa. He was on South Africa's first National Environmental Advisory Committee to the South African Minister of Environment. And I'd like to ask Bobby, if he could, in his presentation, if he could respond as well to a common question that we seem to be having, and that's been rearing its head recently, that we're no longer dealing with climate deniers, but rather climate delayers, and that this has become now a moral issue. And Prof. Vogel has been quite vociferous about this as well. So in your presentation, please, if you could hone in on a response to that as well. Bobby, I'll leave it to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Malik, and thanks for inviting Groundwork on to be able to share some of our thoughts. And Prof. CB, thank you for the space as well. Minister Gordon, fellow panelists, and all protocols observed. Charles, thank you very much for that background. It's really important to recognize that there is a geological issue that affects the city. And yesterday, I was in Dassenhoek in the rolling hills of the outskirts of Durban. And yes, we are a municipality that has complex issues with regards to service delivery, and geology and topography is one of them. It was sad yesterday in Dassenhoek that, I was at a place and I was in a space where 4 children, grandchildren, were lost by my Eugenium and Keys. Stindile and Lazy lost a 17-year-old son who is still missing. And, people note that there's a lack of restorative action by the municipality, not only in Dassenhoek, but in places like Springfield. These are not the first floods. 1 in 100-year, 1 in a 50-year flood process is now a thing of the past. We are living with flooding regularly. 1976, 1987, 2007, 2017, 2019, 2022. So flooding is a regular event, and it is important to recognize it's that the poor that suffers mostly from flooding, and it's Durban's poor that are affected mostly. And Siphuzi Gore will speak about that. But it's been recognized internationally, and Minister Pravin Gordhan will know this. Prime Minister Motley from Barbados, at the Glasgow conference, climate conference last year, was very clear that, on the front lines of climate change, and Durban is on the front line of climate change, people are suffering. And therefore, we need to respond very urgently to this crisis. This is a crisis that affected me personally. So, I don't only advocate, I speak as an activist, I speak as a director of an NGO, and I speak as a commissioner on the Climate Commission. Now, we got this crisis presently with us, but it has a historical context in terms of the development pathway we have chosen as South Africa and the world. So the world is in crisis because we have a particular extractivism where the North got rich and the North plundered the South in terms of its resources, burned too much fossil fuels, got rich, and, they're secure. The North is secure and the rich are secure. They're behind their walls and they're protected, but it's the poor that have not, burnt the fossil fuels that are impacted mostly by what we have today in terms of climate change. And South Africa needs to think very carefully of where and what it takes money for going forward. We know of the $3.75 billion loan that we took to build very big coal-fired power stations that are not operational and are not fully functional today. Those big carbon emitters kept us away of actually taking that money and developing a more resilient society, because that's what we asked for. We said, if the World Bank was going to give us money, they must give us money towards a just transition so that we can protect ourselves, our neighborhoods, we can increase energy access for the poor and get, well-meaning green jobs. Now, South Africa just last year signed a financial type of political agreement with governments from the North for $8.5 billion. The question is, are we as citizens of Durban going to be part of understanding how that money will be used? Because Durban is in a very interesting situation where it has suffered loss and damage, and it needs to adapt to what the climate change impacts are going to be. And we could be putting a package together as Durbanites and going to the Green Climate Fund with government and to say, we need a package to redevelop Durban. And that's important. Redevelop it in a way that looks at just transition, that speaks about an open democracy and an open agenda for just transition, so that all people, the people that lost family, that have banks that have collapsed behind their homes, people that are unemployed. Half of our, working population is unemployed. That everybody can come together and say, okay, how do we use the money around what the North owes the South in terms of debt, ecological debt? How do we use that money that provides infrastructure development that is resilient, housing that's resilient, health systems that are resilient? Consider the fact that more than 80 clinics were impacted upon in these floods over the last week or 2 weeks. So that's really important. We need to build a resilient healthcare system, because the floods, climate change has resulted and will result in health impacts. Because as we were digging sandbags to protect our homes in Springfield behind Macro in Durban, we were digging in soil that was drenched and still being drenched as we were standing there with sewage. So that's really important. That's common throughout Durban. The South Durban Community Environmental Alliance for years have called for a disaster management plan. And because we have not had a disaster management plan by the city, we've seen this flooding impacting upon the poor the most, and over the last 2 decades. And we have said to the president as commissioners, or myself, that we need to act with urgency in terms of dealing with climate change. And urgency means better services for the poor. For the poor, it's not about climate change, it's about services, the resilience that they can build against the floods coming in the future. And so we need to build an economy that's resilient, a health system that's resilient, and services for people that is resilient. So what's the way forward? Some suggestions. We are going to have a restorative, distributive, and a procedural justice system that needs to be put in place, as the Commission wants, and the Commission has called for. And it must start with an open democracy where people are heard, and issues of just repairing a bank behind what a person's home is done in a democratic manner. We have to incrementally rebuild and restructure this city. We need to dig in urgently to stabilize roads and banks. We need a short-term plan to tackle hotspots, but we need a 10 to 30-year plan to re-engineer the city. We need to build a resilient city. We need independent expertise to come in and to look at the city and say, how do we develop a new city, a resilient city? And we need to recognize that the settlement patterns in Durban are wrong. Both townships and fancy Belito apartments are built in the wrong places. So we need to rethink our settlements in Durban. We need to review town planning bylaws that pull all of Durban under one administrative authority, so that service delivery, infrastructure management can be developed in an equitable manner, servicing all people and not just the inner city. We need to rethink governance, so that's open. There's an open democratic process, as I mentioned a few times before, so that people engage together with government in reconstruction. We don't want to be government, but what we want to do is be part of governance, whether it's the local street organizations, the local churches, community-based organization, gift of the givers, groundwork, or abashlali, and that's really important. So thank you very much for this platform, and I hope that in terms of the way forward, we consider what I've said.
Thank you, Bobby. We'll take some questions right now for Bobby. If there are any, please raise your hand or... Okay, there's quite a few actually. Let's do one. Bobby, which one would you like to respond to? There's one by Aradna, there's one by Norman Ward.
Please, you go ahead and ask me, because I haven't got complete control and sight over that. So you just let me know what I should answer.
Okay. Do you think solar power would be affordable to disadvantaged groups in South Africa? Just taken one random question.
Thank you very much for that question. We're working with Abashlali now. Spoo Zikode is here with us. We're working with community people on the Highveld to just answer that question, to think of how do we get solar energy for people on people's roofs so that they are not only users of energy, so that they are producers of energy. Lots of difficulties, policy, technical difficulties, but I think it can be done and we have to work hard at that. In terms of solar energy and renewable energy, it's the cheapest. It will create more jobs. And we need to know that any future energy system of this country must serve first the people, give access to people the energy that is affordable and clean, and it can be done.
Thank you, Bobby. Let's take a question by Norman Ward, and it's a question which I think you're going to enjoy responding to. So Norman asks, don't you think that eThekwini's policy of on-site storage for short-term flood peaks is a waste of time? And should they not be increasing the carrying capacity of rivers as the runoff increases from development? Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, so firstly, I'm not a hydrologist nor geologist. I dabbled in that in the past, but I think the important thing about Durban is Durban has a phenomenal green open space system known as the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System. Ironically, Dr. Deborah Roberts, who has championed that over the last 30 years, is also on the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. So Durban is one of those advanced cities. Yes, it was a relic of the apartheid past, where you had open spaces between black and white, but ironically, it actually serves a purpose. And we need to think of a way to ensure that we don't hard surface the entire Durban. The city should also consider why in townships have people been allowed just to hard surface most of the places, or not only in townships, throughout the city. Why have people just been allowed to hard surface? And what I mean by that is if you have a 600 square meter property, you put concrete over that entire property. It just doesn't make sense. So we need to think of ways of re-engineering the city and settlements over the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Bobby, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And I know that you were busy with lectures today and you took time off to be part of this webinar. Thank you so much for that, Bobby. Let's move to our third speaker for today. And in fact, Bobby's already introduced him in some manner. And that is, of course, Spoo Zikode. Spoo is the founding president of Abashlali Basemjondolo movement of South Africa, which is the shack dwellers movement. He has strongly campaigned for the right to housing under the theme of housing is a human right. His focus area is on safe and dignified housing for all our cities. The migration, Spoo, of unemployed to the city in the hope of jobs, being unable to find reasonably priced accommodation, informal settlements in the fringe areas near floodplains, etc. That's a reality for Durban. Would you like to perhaps work into your presentation whether this has placed the poor and vulnerable at risk to natural hazards and maybe some of the community experiences during the floods? Spoo?
Thank you, Prof. Manik. Greetings to the Minister Pravin Gordhan, all other government officials that are here, professors and communities, and my fellow panelists that are here. As we speak here, Prof, my heart sings. I want to express Abashlali's deep solidarity with many families around this province of KwaZulu-Natal, particularly those who have lost their loved ones. And I've just been in Ane Drive in Reservoir Hills this morning. And Simokuhle Duga, an 8-year girl of Ane Drive, remains missing. And of course, with many others. I cannot imagine how their parents, how her mom sleeps at night when the 8-year daughter is nowhere to be found. And unfortunately, when you are living in the shacks, there aren't anybody who would be interested to accompany you in these difficult moments. Members of the communities, and of course, there was a team of rescue that came to look for Simoguhle, but they all disappeared. Even those who were assisting the family did not say goodbye when they left the family without Simoguhle being found. Now, our lives have been a disaster. Many lives of the shack dwellers are disastrous. Each second, each minute, each day. For us, disasters are not just an event, as you would have seen 2 weeks ago, but the day-to-day lives of ordinary men and women in the informal settlement are disastrous. And it is unfortunately that it is not spoken about until middle class and the rich people get affected and feel the same pain that poor people feel almost every day. These disasters range from us living in muds like pigs, like us living in shack fires. If one family is on fire, suddenly the entire village of shack settlement is on fire. A disaster that many lives have been lost through being electrocuted by the Operation Khanyisa. When people connect themselves to electricity, lives continue to be lost. Lives have been lost by the police. The police have been responsible for the loss of lives in the informal settlements when people have to resist these human indignities which people are forced to live. And of course, Izingabi, the hitmen that have become acceptable and normalized in our society, continue to make us as vulnerable as one would have experienced the floods few days ago. And of course, the daily hunger and starvations under which people are forced to live makes our day-to-day lives a human catastrophe. But it goes unnoticed because these are ordinary people who are forced to live under these conditions. Now, what we have seen is very devastating. It's very shocking. Many of us have witnessed something that is even hard to explain, what we have seen when people were unable to, to come out from the traps of debris and muds. We were unable to eat food when we have seen bodies of people having to dig people ourselves, and in most cases without the support of the professionals, people who are trained to do these rescue work, because often we are on our own. As we speak now, each community that we visit, people tell us that they have hardly seen any government officials, not even what councillors and what committees in these areas. We are on our own. This is very devastating for me to come here and be sharing these stories when people find themselves in the dark, confined corners of our society at this very difficult time. Now, we did not understand the meaning of wetlands, for instance. We did not understand the meaning of demos. Now, over these past few days, we tend to understand why certain areas are not really good for building. The first speaker has already alluded. But I must say again, and answer the question that the media often ask us about people who are building on the flat plain, who are building in a very risky areas, that often people are forced to build over these riverbanks because it turns out that well-located land is being looked after by those who own the means of or properties in these cities. So you would face the guards of the land invasion units, or the politicians would send the anti-land invasion unit if you occupy, for instance, well-located land. Now, land that is dead, that is on the riverbanks, that has swept many people this time around, is the land that often the municipalities are not really worried about. So that is why many communities like the Quarry Road community in Guamamsutu, people are actually living on the river. So that is why many of them have been washed away because there is no land. So the question that we've been raising over the past 16, 17 years since the establishment of Abahlali remains relevant even today. And we are saying, although we may not have been able to control or to prevent the human, of course, the natural disaster that we have witnessed, however, we feel that the impact of this flooding would have somehow been minimized had poor people in particular were allocated with a better land and away from, riverbanks and so on. We are saying the effect of the flooding would not have been at this extremely situation that we are facing now. So this calls upon all of us to really revisit and call upon government officials to take seriously the land questions. And we are saying there must be a rapid land release, urban land, especially for decent housing in our cities for people that are really living in this floodplain. Right now, when we are trying to assist the communities, the question that people are asking, but where do we go from here? Where do we build? Even if you are providing them with building material to rebuild their homes. The question is, but where do we build? We can no longer go back and build where we have lost our loved ones. So in fact, we have learned that the places that we are living in are actually the graves. So people are no longer going to be able to rebuild on the same places where they have lost their loved ones. So there is no government official that is prepared to give guidance, to provide leadership and advice at this time. We are sitting with a big challenge again of having to tell people which land should they be considering. Now, when government does not exist, does not come out in the fore and provide leadership, then you are engaged in the midst of confusion. And again, you'll be seeing people occupying land, maybe in the most dangerous areas again. So that is why we are considering this moment a great moment of unity, a moment of solidarity, a moment of Ubuntu. It is time that we display our high standard of Ubuntu so that we become a more humans at this time. One of the lessons and one of the opportunity that this moment provides is for us to be better human beings. This is what we are calling for as Abahlali at this stage. And I must take this opportunity and of course, thanks those who have really gone out of their way. I know there's so much assistance and solidarity that has come from civil society organizations and individuals and people from around the country, not just in KwaZulu-Natal. People have been flooding aid from Johannesburg and elsewhere. We must take this opportunity and salute those who are reminding us that we can be a better human being. Now, KwaZulu-Natal stands an opportunity to be a better KwaZulu-Natal that is vested in a more humanistic kind of approach. Now, the last thing that I want to say, Prof, moving forward, we are calling for an investment in an infrastructure. A person like Eshek Dwala wouldn't understand the infrastructure language, why it is so important. I think many of us begin to realize that had we invested and maintained our infrastructure, had we had competent contractors and all those people who are given jobs to do our infrastructure work, things would have been much different from what we've seen. So of course, there must be a rapid land release for decent housing. It is important then that people are given well-located land with service sites, even if government cannot build a house for everyone, but if our infrastructure are up to scratch and the service sites that are provided to communities and for us to be able to build our homes, it would make a huge difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sibu. There have been quite a number of questions that have come through, and I think there's also a few comments that I see from Norman and Aradhna, etc. And maybe let me do something different. Let me try and pull in some of the comments and ask you, Sibu, if you could perhaps just add to that or give your view of it. So Norman has stated that the suitable land close to the city has already been developed, and all that is unsuitable has been set aside for demos. And he says that the only suitable land is far from the workplaces and not suitable for poor people. What would you say to a statement like that, Sibu? Would you agree? I see Aradhna's agreed to something like that, and she's also called for the creation of housing. I think that's come up from quite a few of us in today's webinar. Any comments? Anything you'd like to add to that?
Oh, yes, no, absolutely. There are pieces of land, well-located land closer to the city. Of course, it's not as big as one would expect, but surely there are pieces of land that we have identified ourselves, but we are told that it's reserved for businesses, and we have a serious problem with the social value of land being put after its commercial value. So as long as we put profit before human needs, before social needs, then we have a serious problem. So that is why government moved from housing to what they call Department of Human Settlement, because wherever you build a house, there must be active economic opportunities for people to find employment. So as long as you push people away from the cities and away from job opportunities, then you are actually creating a problem. So we are saying even if the well-located land is far away, but that must come with jobs, because people come to cities to be closer to job opportunities and for other, for education, for healthcare facilities that are up to standard. So as long as these houses are built as standalone without other infrastructure, then we have a problem. That is why people would rent out these homes built far away from the cities or sell them, and you find people running back to the shacks. Government build them houses far away from the cities. Either they sell those homes or they rent them out and they run back to informal settlement. And you are saying people are mad. Government build them homes, but they still run back to the mud like pigs. That's what happens when you do not consult meaningfully with those who are meant to benefit.
Sibu, just one aspect I want to just hone in on here, and that has to do with, and it's come through quite significantly in the comments and the questions, and that is living with dignity, and particularly in terms of the poor and living in dignity. Is there something or some experiences that you'd like to share with us about how important this is for South Africans, and particularly for those residents that are living in these informal settlements with very little hope of having some form of dignity to their lives?
Prof, as I said earlier on, our whole lives have been a life of indignity. How we are treated as poor communities tells you that you are not really dealing with human beings, you're actually dealing with trash. This is how we feel when we are ruled with violence, when we are engaged with violence, and in that you are creating a violent nation. So it is true that poor shack dwellers and many poor communities, particularly Black Africans, are treated as if they are beneath the law. This is not a question of budget constraint or shortage of housing. How we engage with communities on a daily basis has to change. how we are treated has to change if we are really want to build welcoming cities and the country that, that needs to be recognized for its recognition to its human beings. For us, it would be a mistake to define a human being in isolation to others. We must and we have to treat people with respect and dignity, irrespective of their socioeconomic standards or background. We are human beings and we ought to behave like human beings to one another if we are to succeed in any challenge that we are faced with.
Thank you, Sibu. We just hope that people are being treated during this period of time with dignity. And that's all we can appeal for, I think, that people are treated with levels of dignity. Thank you, Sibu. Let's move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Emmanuel Letebele. He's the acting manager for the strategic planning branch of eThekwini municipality. On behalf of the municipality in South Africa, Emmanuel has been part of a global project, Cities Fit for Climate Change. That's excellent to hear, Emmanuel. And he's had various partners in this, Germany, India, etc. And he tells us that the project aims to strengthen cities as actors of sustainable development. We'd like to hear much more about this, Emmanuel, particularly in light of planning, spatial planning. We know that there's little doubt that urbanization has been responsible for changing landscapes. We know that urbanization is a hot potato for the city of Durban. And we also know that there are calls for strategic urbanization. Please tell us what exactly is on the cards for Durban in terms of spatial planning, and try and hone in, if you can, on hazard preparation, whether there was sufficient hazard preparation in terms of the floods. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Professor, and greetings to everybody in the meeting, all the distinguished guests. You have been recognized and all protocols observed. Please allow me to share my presentation, and then please confirm if you can see it once I've done this. Yes. I think first thing, I have to indicate that we stand in solidarity with all the communities within the eThekwini municipality and the KwaZulu-Natal province at large that has been impacted in one way or the other by the devastating floods that hit the city and the province. And it is against that backdrop that we felt that it is important that we also add our voice to this platform as to what role is it that the municipality is playing, particularly looking at it from a spatial planning perspective as well as a climate change perspective. So the presentation structure will be as follows. Let me just sort of ensure that it's in full presentation mode. Yes. The presentation structure is as follows. I will first speak to the causes of and impacts of flooding. Then I will look at the reasons behind urbanization, and then we'll take a view on what does the municipality do in the space of hazard risks, and also I will also touch on the subject of vulnerabilities of the various communities that we serve. So basically, what are the causes of flooding? Right up at the top, the primary cause of flooding is largely informed by, which unfortunately leads to other devastating events such as landslides and damage to infrastructure. But also we must acknowledge that land degradation also plays a part in the causes of flooding. deforestation of catchment areas that serve the municipality and or the province is also a contributor. And previous speakers have also, mentioned about increased population density along riverbanks, and it is a concern to the municipality. And we acknowledge that, yes, there are challenges in that space, but there are plans in place that speaks against the establishment of formal or informal residents along riverbanks due to the, obvious risks that it poses to the community. There's also an acknowledgement that poor land use planning, zoning, and control of flood plain development is a contributor to flooding. There's also an aspect about inadequate drainage, particularly in cities, that also contribute to flooding. But also during the recent storm events, you would have probably heard or noticed through various media platforms that due to the volume of water that the various water bodies were receiving, such as dams, dams are also becoming increasingly at risk during storm events like this. So they had to also open their sluice gates, which unfortunately led to more volume of water and a high velocity of water flowing from the dams into the water bodies, and unfortunately creating a devastating impact along all the water bodies within the municipality. So in short, those are the causes of flooding. Now, we will look at the question of urbanization and its causes. And we look at this from the city against the countrywide perspective that says South Africa is urbanizing rapidly. It is probably estimated that 63% of South Africans are living in urban areas. And it is projected that the statistics will rise to about 71%, I think, in 2030. By 2050, 8 in 10 people will be living in urban areas, and this will increase demand on basic infrastructure requirements. And as the previous speakers have mentioned, the rapid rate of urbanization has severely impacted Durban's natural resources. And it is concerning that about 33% of the original habitat types are still remaining. And we are saying this bearing in mind about the role that the various habitat types play in stabilizing the various soil layers, as articulated earlier by the doctor who spoke to some of the underlying causes in terms of geological formations. Now, when we take a bit of a deep dive in terms of industrialization, what we have realized is that more people have been attracted to move from the rural areas to urban areas on account of improved employment opportunities. And we see that as one of the key drivers of industrialization and a contributor to population density in urban areas. Well, we have to also look at the aspect of commercialization, wherein better commercial opportunities and returns are obtained in urban areas in comparison to rural areas. So that's another key driver for urbanization. When we look at social benefits and services, we acknowledge that urban areas provide better educational facilities, better living standards, better sanitation and housing, better health care, better recreation facilities, and better social life in general as compared to what is experienced in rural areas. Again, employment opportunities wherein services and industries in urban areas generate and increase higher value added jobs. And also this leads to more employment opportunities, or at least the perception that there is more employment opportunities in urban areas. The rural-urban transformation phenomena is also at play, wherein rural communities start to adopt to the urban culture and ultimately become urban centers in rural localities that continue to grow as more people move to such locations in search for a better life. So there is an acknowledgement that there is the urban to rural movement of people in search for opportunities, but there is also the phenomena at play wherein rural areas are fastly urbanizing. Well, the municipality, and in particular the spatial planning department, looks at hazard risk through a lens of disaster risk reduction. For example, the spatial development framework speaks about 4 priority areas that speak to risk. Priority 1 is understanding disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability. capacity, exposure of persons, assets, hazard characteristics, as well as the environment. And we also acknowledge that knowledge can be used for risk assessment in terms of ensuring certain prevention measures are put in place, mitigation measures are put in place, as well as preparedness and response. So I will speak to this aspect a little bit later when I do outline an example of how the city working with the community in informal settlements, the academia, as well as various municipal departments contributed in efforts to spare the lives of the people in one informal settlement that I will mention just in a moment. Priority 2 speaks to strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. By that, we mean that disaster risk governance is a very important tool for prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, as well as recovery and rehabilitation. And it fosters collaboration and partnership. And we have heard various speakers putting across, their views in terms of what, contributes to, the type of disaster that we experience. And I think there needs to be an acknowledgement across the board that all urban actors have a role to play in mitigating and or ensuring that the disasters that are occurring now are at least mitigated going into the future. Priority 3 speaks to investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. There we are speaking about public and private investment in disaster risk prevention, as well as reduction through structural and non-structural measures, which are essential to enhance the economic, social, health, and cultural resilience of persons, communities, as well as our country or countries, and their assets, as well as the environment. Priority 4 speaks to enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response, and importantly, to build back better in terms of recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So we are saying there's a need to strengthen disaster preparedness for response. There's a need to take action in anticipation of events such as the one that hit the city and the province, in order to ensure that capacities are in place for effective response and recovery at all levels. The recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction phase is also a critical opportunity to build back better. So we do agree with previous speakers in terms of how there is a need to perhaps stop, pause, and delete what we think are good urban solutions, because surely they have worked, but given the unprecedented storm event that hit the city, there is a need for us to rethink our strategies and to do better. Looking at vulnerable communities, we look at vulnerability as a dynamic phenomenon, because the levels of change due to improvements and degradation of the social and environmental conditions, as well as the interventions that are in place to reduce vulnerability, are quite dynamic. And this is the image that shows in the center of the presentation, the picture that is heart-wrenching, in that the poorest of the poor were hit by this flood event. But I'll also speak to, like I indicated, when I touch on the last bullet point on this slide, the informal community that we collaborated with to ensure that at least some human lives or human lives is spared. Not some, I do apologize. I meant to say that human life is spared. eThekwini has very high levels of development in comparison to other municipalities in KwaZulu-Natal, given its status as a metro municipality. But this in itself is a strength, but also a weakness, because due to the consequential vulnerability to essential services failure, for example, during the current flood event, there is electricity failure, there is lack of water, and this is precisely, the point that we are trying to raise, that there are multiple risks that our communities are facing at this point in time. And the city, given its resources, is doing all that is possible to respond to all the areas of need. Now, there are conditions of vulnerability and susceptibility to the impact of hazards that are determined by physical, social, economic, as well as environmental conditions or processes. There are also areas of high vulnerability that can be found throughout the municipality. And these are found in rural areas, in informal areas, as well as major commercial and industrial areas, which seem combined to have a highest vulnerability ratings. Now, we do have a district development model in place, and the diagnostic report under focal area strategic goal 1 is about people. And when the previous speaker was talking, he placed people at the center of development, and I could not agree with him more. Because now, in terms of the district development model, the vision is that by 2040, poverty will be eliminated, vulnerability will be reduced, and a desired future is one that there is vulnerability reduction as well as improved resilience. So please allow me to speak a little bit about the map on the right. What it's showing is, it shows the entire province of KwaZulu-Natal as an area that is susceptible to extremely high likelihood of being flooded. So also there is an acknowledgement that throughout the entire municipality, areas that are both formal, informal, rural, business, churches, schools, clinics, they were all impacted. And this calls for all urban actors within the city to play their role in this process. So I think, let me also mention a little bit about, and the previous speaker also made reference to the Quarry Road informal settlement, wherein, for example, through collaboration with various municipal departments, such as the Human Settlements Department, the Coastal Stormwater and Catchment Management Department, and the academia from UKZN, the School of Built Environment and Development Studies, worked with the community in the Quarry Road informal settlement. And they developed what is called a focused early warning system, wherein the information that is derived from the South African Weather Service through the municipality's disaster management department is communicated to both the academics from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as the leadership, elected leadership from the Quarry Road informal settlement. That communicates the risk that is looming, meaning it indicates to them the rain levels in the rivers, and it gives them an idea about how long it might take for the water or the volume of water to get to a point where it will begin to have an effect on some of the informal structures. So in turn, what the community members do with this information is they communicate amongst the community structures, inform them about the risk that is looming. And in that way, they begin to now, for example, in the current event, communication started happening with the Quarry Road informal settlement on a Sunday before the Monday, 11 April. So already some of the community members from the Quarry Road informal settlements were able to move their children from their informal settlements to places of safety. Then that also was followed by the community being able to move either some of their important documents, personal documents, qualification, or their prized possessions out of the dwellings that were in the line of risk. And I must also mention that the collaboration between the municipality, the academia, and community leaders led to a process of hazard mapping, wherein the community are educated about which informal settlements are at high risk of being flooded, and therefore there are safe structures that are built within Quarry Road informal settlements where people can begin to move away from the danger into less risk-prone areas. And also some of the business community close by also allow some of the people in the event of a flood to gather in a safe space so as to be away from the looming danger. Why am I talking about all of this? It is because, and with acknowledgement of the devastating impact at the Quarry Road informal settlements in April this year, due to the collaboration between the various actors that I've mentioned, there was no direct loss of life as a direct result of flooding. Unfortunately, there was one life lost, which is one too many, and it was due to infrastructure failure as a result of electrocution. So the lessons derived from the collaboration between the academia and the university is telling us that empowering people builds resilience. People in KwaZulu informal settlement were able to act based on expert advice from the academia as well as from the local government authority to forewarn them about the risk, and they were able to communicate amongst themselves using WhatsApp communication and being able to move to places of safety. So we do intend to continue to collaborate with the partners that I've mentioned so as to try and replicate some of the lessons learned from the KwaZulu informal settlements and replicate it in other informal settlements across the city. We do acknowledge that it's a mammoth task, that not all informal settlements are the same and not all of them face the same risk. In fact, they face a multitude of risks, and those risks are acknowledged. With that being said, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I appreciate the platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. So there's quite a few questions here. I'm not quite sure whether we'd be able to go through so many. We actually are indeed running out of time. But I think let's take one, Emmanuel, if we can. When was the last time, and this question is by Himolate Mbere, when was the last time flood studies and modeling was done by the eThekwini municipality, and what were the outcomes? I'm just going to take the first part of that question.
Thank you very much for the question. I must indicate that given where I work in the municipality within the strategic planning branch, I may not be best placed to provide a direct response to the question. But I think it is safe to say that when we do consider development planning applications, there are quite a number of sector departments that are mandated to ensure that we do not allocate or grant permissions for sites to be built within floodplains. And it is unfortunate that within the city itself, there are instances where communities, due to various reasons, for example, lack of accessible land, do have to settle in areas that are prone to risk. So I think I must admit that in terms of flood studies and modeling being done, probably the department that works with coastal stormwater and catchment management are better placed to respond to that question. But I think, if I may, moderator, with your permission, allow me to also speak a little bit about what you mentioned at the beginning in terms of the global project Cities Fit for Climate Change. I think the idea there was to ensure and mainstream climate change across all municipal departments, ensure that each department has a responsibility to play in mitigating or adapting to the impacts of climate change. So what we have established now in the city is a climate change committee that is being led by the mayor and the political administration. And there is also, it is ably supported by the administration executive. And that climate change committee ensures that we developed in 2020 the climate action plan that speaks to each role player within the city, having to ensure that when they plan their budget, when they implement, they do that through the climate change lens. So the work has been done at the city. What follows will surely have to deal with implementation. And the recent events, I think, has called all of us to action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. There are quite a few comments and statements that actually relate to climate change. And I want to leave those for next week because we do have Sean O'Donoghue and we have one of Emmanuel's colleagues as well, who's attending the webinar on Tuesday, both as presenters. So I think some of the questions that that are being asked right now, I think that they will be answered next week by the relevant department in eThekwini municipality. So that's a reason, I suppose, as well for many of you to also join us again next week on Tuesday. There is a question, Emmanuel, I want, please, if you could answer very, very briefly. Is there a disaster management plan for the municipality as Bobby had intimated there was no such plan. Or do you want to leave this for next week? Where we
no such plan that has been worked with communities throughout the municipality. There might be a plan, but we haven't seen it or worked with it. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bobby. Emmanuel, you want to respond? Or you want to
Prof, thank you for the question, Prof. All that I'm aware of is that within the spatial development framework, there is a chapter that speaks to disaster management, and there is the various points that I've presented here were taken straight out of the spatial development framework that speaks to disaster reduction. And we do engage communities on the need for them to comment on the spatial development framework, because it is a public document. And I think it is important that when the public are given an opportunity to comment, they also focus on chapters that speak to disaster risk reduction as well as climate change. And I must mention that it is a public document, it's out in the public domain. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for all your time. And we'll be, of course, speaking to your colleagues much more in depth next week when we start to unpack exactly how is it that we want to plan for the future and what are the ingredients for that in terms of disaster risk reduction. I want to now move to the last speaker for the day, and that is Tashmika Sharma. Tashmika is a PhD candidate in disaster management, so we're still keeping with the topic of disaster management. And she is in the discipline of environmental sciences at UKZN. Her interests lie in climate change, disaster management, and environmental justice. So she is going to pull all of these various threads we've been listening to today and give us some feedback in terms of her latest research and her engagement. Tashmika, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Prof. Good afternoon to everyone, Minister, professors, and academics, all protocol observed. I'm just going to share my screen, and I'm also going to answer that question on disaster management plan for the city. Okay, because that's what I'm looking at with specific reference to South Durban. But of course, I'm looking at the KZN floods this afternoon. Let me just, are you able to see my screen, Prof? Okay.
Yes.
All right, so just to give you a little bit of background, I'm also, apart from doing disaster management research, I sit on various councils in provincial government. And one of the documents that I work with is the KwaZulu-Natal baseline documentation. The other is the provincial climate change strategy. And the Paris Agreement with the National Department of Forestry, Fishery and Environment. Okay, and one of the things that I always propose as a young member of those councils is to get the private sector to minimize their greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, because remember, a disaster doesn't just happen. Okay, there are so many events that lead up to the culmination or the happening of a disaster. So remember here we had our COP presentation, and that's where our Paris Agreement came out from. And one of the main things that came out of this Paris Agreement was that we need to reach net zero, which was defined quite nicely. We have to limit our increase to 1.5 degrees. The science dictates by the second half of the century, we should be producing less carbon than we take out of the atmosphere. Okay, so one of the things that I want to bring to our attention because of these extreme weather events, not just in KwaZulu-Natal, but remember in the Western Cape as well, that experienced the droughts and they didn't have water. I think it was 2017, 2018, day zero. Now we, for example, received almost 70% of South Africa's mean annual rainfall in just a 24-hour period, between KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. How did this happen? And of course, we know about climate change. We know about the greenhouse effect, about the emissions trapping the heat and increasing the temperature, or the global temperature. But in addition to the greenhouse effect, there are other natural or geological cycles at play. So what I want to remind everybody of is we have this as climate change, and it's driven by the greenhouse effect as well as something called the Milankovitch cycle. Okay, so our Milankovitch cycle is orbital, all right, and this orbital cycle, they happen over hundreds of thousands of years. So if you look at the top, we see here is the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. So it changes every couple of hundred thousands of years. There's a time where planet Earth is closest to the sun, right, known as perihelion, that takes place in January. And then it changes to an aphelion, which takes place in July, right? And that cycle of the orbit changing from elliptical to sort of circular happens every couple of hundreds of thousands of years. Then we have your obliquity cycle. And that means the tilt of your Earth's axis varying. And what that does is when your axis varies, or the tilt of the Earth's axis varies, it changes, or it makes the contrast in the seasons more extreme. All right, so we will then be expecting to see more extreme weather events. And I think at the moment, the Earth's axis is tilted at 23.4 degrees. So we are expecting to see some major extreme events favoring deglaciation, which means melting of glaciers or melting cycle, right? And then of course your precession of the equinoxes and your axial precession just makes your seasonal contrast more extreme in one hemisphere and less extreme in the other. But the point that I'm trying to show you between the greenhouse effect and between your Milankovitch cycles is that we must be aware that there are various environmental or geological factors at play in addition to our human-induced processes. So we must be aware of this when we are polluting and when we are engaging in activities that are not sustainable. So just something for us to be aware of. And then remember, in addition to those greenhouse effects and Milankovitch cycle, we also have your La Nina El Nino cycle at play. All right, so we know what happened on the, during the first week of April 2022, and you may have seen this image circulating around from Weather SA. We saw that South Africa, or KwaZulu-Natal, had the subtropical depression over it. And around this time, I think it was the 11th of April, we had 300 millimeters of rain fall in just a 24-hour period. Now that was significant because it was, as I did mention, most of South Africa's mean annual rainfall in just a one-day period. Of course, this would have pressured infrastructure. Of course, this would have led to a loss of many lives, as we did see. But again, I think it was a stark reminder to many of us that we cannot outdo the forces of nature, that there was a clear need for further investment in infrastructure, especially resilient infrastructure when it came to marginalized communities, and definitely having to look at better storm water drainage systems, or to increase the number of stormwater drainage systems and invest more in that. All right. And remember, KwaZulu-Natal experiences a subtropical climate, whereas, for example, Western Cape experiences a Mediterranean climate. So a lot of our geology, as Dr. Charles showed us, and I think some other speakers mentioned, hilly terrains were part of the environmental factors that influenced, the environmental damage that we saw during the floods. Okay, so just to let you know how many houses were destroyed. Okay, we're seeing all the districts here throughout KwaZulu-Natal, and you see houses, more than 12,000 were destroyed and almost 4,000 partially destroyed. An estimated approximately 40,700 people affected, more than 16,000 houses destroyed. And the Department of Education released statistics, I think just 2 weeks ago, over 630 schools were completely damaged, of which 124 have irreparable damage. And I think, this then resulted in a severe strain on the institutional capacity of local government and even provincial government. And we saw during this time a lot of community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, civil society organizations coming together to help to alleviate that strain. But again, just reminding us, excuse me, that we needed effective governance here. And what is governance? People mistake governance for being the way government runs a particular department. But no, governance is in fact a relationship. It is a relationship between the government, the private sector, and the public sector, all working together in unison. And of course, then our fiscal resources, our financial resources being channeled in the right directions and in the right areas. We see that the valuation roll, property value at risk, up to 7 billion, your annual rate income and your value at risk, and the different suburbs in a risk ranking profile. And this information that I've received very recently from the eThekwini municipality through the various government networks that I work through, came in bits and pieces, really, because we didn't have a risk ranking profile, because we don't have a well-structured disaster management plan. And I'm going to get to that in just a bit. We should have learned these lessons from 2017 and 2019, all right? We see that the city is likely to lose between 1.5 to 2% of its GDP due to the floods. We saw this happen not just in 2017, 2019, 1987, as well as 2007. So this isn't something that should have been new to us. It wasn't something that we should not have been prepared for. Obviously, as an environmental scientist, this is something that we've been talking about for a very long time. So I don't see why we did not put more effort into restructuring our disaster management plan, or bringing on more public participation from the private sector, and more effort from government side in terms of drawing up a better disaster management plan. Okay. And just to let you know the number of businesses that were affected throughout KwaZulu-Natal. And if you look at the different industrial parks, Springfield, your River Horse Valley, Phoenix Industrial Park, Mgeni Business Park, it's going to take a very long time for us to recover. I would estimate, far more than 3 months. What does that mean in terms of economic livelihoods? What does that mean in terms of poverty and those who are marginalized? So it's really, the repercussions are something that are going to be long-term. There are different measures that are put in place from the Department of Small Business Development, from Industrial Development Corporation. We have the Itala Development Finance, Corporate, etc., Department of Social Development, our Motsepe Foundation, our eThekwini, etc., and the Community Scheme Ombuds, services. But again, I feel that far more needs to be done. And I think a very, something that did come out quite strongly, or a challenge that government is facing, is transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to fiscal resources and where the funding is being channeled, right? So that's just to remind us. Now, bringing us back to disaster management, because this, I'm not going to read the entire thing. This was declared a national state of disaster. We, we know about disaster management. It's been something that has been discussed at a global level, and obviously at a provincial level, and now of course a local level. But definitely when we look at disaster management, we need to be far more effective in our planning when it comes to risk ranking profile. We need to use an integrated approach, which is missing. Okay, we need the appropriate personnel in the right places. And when I say disaster management and when I say appropriate personnel, I'm trying to be very literal, because if you form the disaster management unit, you cannot get through the disaster management unit, even when there's no disaster. So during a disaster, I can't imagine what's going on. I know there are area-based disaster management plans, but as to whether it's being implemented, that's a different story. We need maps. We don't have a map showing us emergency exits, fire stations to contact our firefighters, paramedics, the nearest clinics and hospitals, where we should be looking at in terms of stormwater drainage systems, infrastructure. I work with many faith-based organizations, etc., community-based organizations. Where do we turn to besides these community organs? So it's something that, or this disaster is something that goes so beyond us, and not having a disaster management plan is absolutely shocking, because the primary effects are our infrastructural damage, our loss of lives, water and electricity supplies damage. One life lost is one life too many. And then, of course, beyond the primary effects are your secondary impacts. There will be your waterborne diseases, your long-term economic impacts, education. Where does that leave youth in South Africa? How are we investing in that? So just a bit of background knowledge about disaster management. Remember, this was discussed long, before we even became a democracy in the 1990s. Started off with the Yokohama strategy, then to the Hyogo framework for action, etc. And then your World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction brought this to our attention. In South Africa, we looked to incorporate the framework of disaster management, showing us your pre-disaster phase, your post-disaster phase. And I'm not going to get into mitigation, etc., because I know this is something that's going to be discussed next week. But just reminding us that our level of preparedness needed to be far more effective than it was this time around. Okay, so again, I bring us back to this point. Do we have the correct personnel? If we are talking to the private sector, what does that mean? So property owners, are we asking them to change their piping systems to breakwater systems? Are we asking them to change their lighting systems to energy saving systems? I'm saying being very, very literal. I don't like, using academic terms like this and then going home and forgetting about it. What are you actually doing? How are we turning to sustainable practices? Are we looking for cleaner and greener energy options? So how will we invest? Now, coming to my main research domain, and this is about disaster management planning in the eThekwini municipality. If you go to the eThekwini municipality website right now and you look for their disaster management plan, this is what comes up. I just took a couple of pages, and my apologies if it's not clear to you, but just to outline, because to be quite honest, you're not missing out on anything. It talks about the Joint Operations Center, the different, mechanisms of a disaster management framework, the fact that it's going to be revised over 2 years, the fact that it's going to be updated. No sort of, talking about any integrating of scientific data in here. No talking about any sort of appropriate personnel. No mention of emergency exits. No mention of mapping or what I should be doing in the event of a disaster. Very descriptive, written, I think in 2009. hasn't been updated since, and we've had more than one extreme event, before this KZN flooding. So how does one turn to disaster management for the city? Now, I think it was 2 years ago, there was an article written in the newspaper saying that the disaster management, in eThekwini is a disaster in itself. How do we use this? Now, this doesn't mean anything to me as an environmentalist. How will this mean anything to anybody in a rural area, somebody in an informal dwelling, informal setting? It's about disaster justice. It's about environmental justice. And again, I bring it back. It's about risk ranking profiles. It's about rewriting the policy to make sure that it actually becomes effective and implemented on the ground. And again, about having the right people in the right places and the funding going to the right places. So I think, at the very least, this being a disaster management plan for eThekwini it's a bit embarrassing, to be honest. It's something that we can, really need more knowledge on in terms of expertise, more input from indigenous knowledge systems, traditional leaders, academics. We need to be calling on all our provincial climate change councils, and of course, the National Department of Forestry, Fishery and Environment. I don't think this is something that can just remain within the domain of local government or provincial government. This requires an integrated approach. I think if you go, and I'm going to speak to everybody today, go to the website, have a look at this disaster management plan. And, how do you use this? How will one use this? So I don't want to say, look, now when the disaster already happened, now it's time for us to get up and write. I speak now as a student of the university. I also speak as a policy writer sitting on various councils, that this is not how, I want to write for people in my province. This is not what I want people who are marginalized to be subjected to. We should be doing things like this, mapping, mapping, and that's exactly what I'm doing in my PhD at the moment. So this is actually taken from the it's a provincial website, Coastal KZN, which I produced using some shapefiles. And again, just took the different shapefiles to show you the population, across the different districts in KwaZulu-Natal, which areas were affected by the 2007 flood and the 1987 flood. So again, this was something that was given, that we were introduced to in 1987. We were introduced to it in 2007. So again, just to reinforce the fact that it's not anything that we, that is new to us, and disaster management should be prioritized on our urban agendas and on our national agendas. Just to remind everybody very quickly that we are living in a time where, pollution is at its highest, and we are producing chemicals and things that we don't even fully understand the extent to which it can damage us. Just to remind you again, remember what or how powerful we were as a community when we came together against the oil and gas sector for what Shell, etc., and Engine wanted to do. Very quickly, because I know time is running out.
Actually, it's run out, Tash, sorry. We are 15 minutes over. May I please worry you to just round up? I'm sure we'll drag you into another seminar.
Yes. No problem, sorry. No, so I just wanted to remind everybody that, South Africa, we are ranked 30th in the world for our air pollution. So it's something for us to, be aware of. We've set our own standards according to, the World Health Organization. We have allowed certain companies to circumvent our air quality laws. We are marginalizing the marginalized even further. We are not including them in our environmental justice objectives when we should be. And remember, public participation is a cornerstone of our policy framework. So it's something that we should be turning towards. And I'm just ending off with this quote from the Nobel laureate, just to remind us that, remember, this is something that requires an integrated approach, as I did say, and that we must remember, that the environment is something that we cannot exploit and demolish and destroy. Thank you.
Tash, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time at all for a single question, but that will be so grossly unfair if we didn't at least allow one person to ask a question. And so let me see if we can just quickly pull up one for you. Okay. All right, I'm getting lots and lots of comments, Tashmika, that this forum that we've created, this webinar now should not end, and it needs to be an ongoing set of seminars. And I hear loud and clearly that we do need to keep the momentum. A quick one is about action plans. So Tash, I think, can we leave that for next week? Because next week's webinar is about planning, and I'm sure we can invite you again to provide some kind of response to that. I want to maybe just take some, if at least one other question. Sorry, this is so many comments. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, Tash, if you had to offer up an action plan, okay, for next week, all right, very quickly, what would that comprise of?
Sorry, are you talking about an action plan in terms of this disaster management?
Yes, integration. You've mentioned integration repeatedly.
Yes, yes.
Who would you like to bring on board in terms of integration and stakeholders that need to be included? Please just give us a brief idea. Then next week we can also build on this in the webinar.
Yes. So remember, I always use the word integration because, and I mentioned this, when we look at governance, and I said governance it's the government working together with the private sector and the public sector in unison. What we are finding, not just in South Africa, but all over the world, is that the government always works with the private sector, and we feel many times public is left out. So we want to see a very great presence of the public sector, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, civil society organizations coming on board into disaster management plan. And then not only just public, and this is not only just for the National Department of Forestry, Fishery, Environment, because remember, the fight for the environment is not just about the environmental scientists fighting. We should be bringing on Department of Social Development, the Department of Labor, the Department of Health, the Department of Education. This is where I say, we should be changing the school curriculum. Why isn't life orientation, why are we learning the same nonsense you learn in life orientation, and you not teach things about environmental justice, subsistence farming, intrinsic value of the environment? It's too late to teach somebody when they're 25 about the environment. They're stuck in their ways,
Thank you so much, Tash. Sorry, did I cut you off? You want to just add a few words to finish up?
And just last, the private sector, we really need to call out on, the private sector to be changing their ways, challenging them to meet their economic objectives with the least environmental impact. So that's what I would like to see more of.
Okay, thank you very much, Tash. for your passion and for your energy and for all the statistics as well and the work that you're doing on your PhD. I think in terms of concluding, the writing is on the wall for us all. We will pick up the disaster management plan next week. We note that there are some valuable takeaways that all stakeholders need to be roped in, that integration is the key in terms of public-private participation, in terms of government engaging with communities to make realistic, to carve out realistic plans. We note that there have been questions around, do we have an evacuation plan or not? And of course, most importantly, we have realized in this webinar that as Tash has stated, a disaster just doesn't happen. And we have seen that this disaster was a result of a multitude of factors. We are living in abnormal times, but it's clear that we are just not learning some of the key lessons. The frequency of extreme events, we've seen this statistically. Those have all increased. Hazard preparedness has to be foregrounded and community resilience has to be strengthened, which is what we're going to look into next week. We see KZN in terms of this hazard of place. It's not just the geology. It's also the meteorology. It's also climate change. It's communication with residents. It's education. All of these and strategic urbanization plan as well. Inadequate investment in housing, in infrastructure. All of this actually creates a Molotov cocktail. We've got all the ingredients in KZN, and the fuse was just the flood, actually, to ignite a disaster. So I know that you're not going to be happy going away today. You may go away satisfied with some answers, but if anything, I want you to be disturbed. Be very disturbed because, as I've stated, the writing is on the wall. It's been there for some time. We need to now start being proactive. So please make a note in your diary for the 3rd of May at 2 p.m. next week, Tuesday. So we're going to focus on sustainable solutions. We're going to question this disaster management plan that Bobby has raised and several others have raised. And I note Bobby's comment that we are not government, but we are part of governance. And we'll pick this up next week. We'll pick up the early warning systems, etc., how we can mitigate and adapt to the expected hazards, which we all know are on the way. I'm going to now hand you over to Dr. Angela James, and she will say a brief vote of thanks for us. Dr. James.
Thank you so much. And I'm quite sure that everybody is burning and burning in all parts of your body. When you think about the extent to which all this has been taking place over such a long time and the history, and we learn from history, but have we learned from this history? And that's something that we need to actually talk about. I do want to, and I know time, so I'm just going to say one thing. I did prepare a whole presentation as well for like 2 minutes, but I do want to say that maybe we should not be calling it a disaster management plan. Because think about it, the autopsy is done when the person's dead. The management of the disaster is done when it's done. So why are we not looking at it? And I love Tashnika's use of the word integrated. Why are we not looking at an integrated, holistic, community-based, safe living plan or working plan? Something of that sort, which is so much more engaging, enhancing, and it's so much more positive as well. I think we need to rethink who we are, what we do, and how we do whatever we are doing. So on that note, I do want to say, and as a vote of thanks, thank you so much to Prof. Thabo Msibi for being part and really being one of the people within our School of Education who is really stimulating us to think and to challenge and to push boundaries even further. And we do stimulate ourselves. Let me just say that as well too. And a special thank you to Prof. Manik Sadhna. I mean, Sadhna has done extensive work trying to put this all together, and really well done, Sadhna. I think, you know, people could say, well, we really have so many people out there who need support, who need help, but education, us understanding, how did we get here? What do we do from this point onwards so that we come to an integrated plan that is really a safe living space and that we are resilient? I must say, all the negative words that were used in these presentations made my heart and my head and everything burn as well. I do want to say thank you to all the facilitators, to Charles. That geology, I mean, those moving soils, etc., really got me thinking more particularly about where and why and the importance of our coastal plains and the lay of our lands. Bobby, obviously, from the history and your ongoing activism, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So, Boo, in terms of the dignity and living with dignity is something that we really need to be thinking about. And the statement that you made is, we are on our own. Whew, that's heavy. And then Ketley Dira Lang, for your presentation with regard to the city and the types of thinking and action, and certainly progressive action that still needs to be taken, needs to be worked with. And Tashmika for challenging and really making us think differently about how we should be instead of what it is that we are. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to members of the media, Corporate Relations Division, ICS for being available, and obviously thank you everybody for being present, local, national, international people, and thank you for staying and being on time at the beginning and also staying right to the end. Thank you so much. Over to you again. Sadhna, I don't know if you want to still say something else or just remind about next week.
Yes. I will see everybody again next week, same time, 2 o'clock. We're going to aim to finish at 3:30, because today's webinar was supposed to be an hour and a half, and we've moved it in, and actually we've taken 2 hours. But I think these were conversations we needed to have, and the things that needed to be said, which we did. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again as well to the Minister for attending, and to everybody else that participated in one way or the other. This is only successful because we come together. And so let us come together once more and build the framework for the future that we want to see occur. So I will see you next week, Tuesday, the 3rd of May at 2 p.m. Take care. God bless. Goodbye.